and and so we are on. And so, good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Transforming Guyana, Season 2, Episode 5. Today, we want to tackle the challenge of transparency and accountability in the emerging oil and gas economy. I am Terrence Blackman, Chair and Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. As always, I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade Incorporated. As is always, I'd like to share a bit of the vision for these webinars, and it is to provide innovative and practical recommendations that advance the goal of an open, safe, prosperous, cohesive Guyana in which all Guyanese, irrespective of race, class, ethnicity, or religious persuasion, share equitably in the economic prosperity of Guyana. And to this end, this webinar series, Transforming Guyana, and as you've noted, we're now in our 12-5. This is our 17th program. We've been on air every month on the second Wednesday for the last 17 months. We bring together experts, prominent voices from Guyana, the Caribbean, the diaspora around the world to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development and to offer a nuanced look at Guyana's opportunities and potential pitfalls and to explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts that the oil revenues can have on Guyana's people and future while mitigating the risks that other countries have faced. And since we're coming to you from the diaspora, to also identify roles such as this one that folks in the diaspora can play in this transition. So today we're joined for the hour by some really wonderful guests who I'll introduce to you. Ambassador Michael Skoll, a pioneer in the field of anti-corruption and counter-money laundering services, and an active advisor to governments, multinational institutions, and private firms. He's the principal of the binational U.S.-Colombia consortium, Skoll-Cerna, and the ambassador is also a senior associate of Manchester Trade in Washington, D.C., member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's the president of the Venezuelan American Association of the United States. Let me also welcome Dr. Troy Thomas, who, when we met, was the director of undergraduate research at the University of Guyana. Dr. Thomas holds a PhD in comparative science of culture, focusing on survey and methodological issues from the University of Ghent. Dr. Thomas is a former president of the Transparency Institute in Guyana, which is a chapter of Transparency International. Two of my personal favorites, Mr. Elson Lowe is the economic and youth policy advisor to the opposition leader in Guyana, and he has served as a previous leader of the opposition. I'm sorry, not as a previous leader, but he served as the State Assets Recovery Agency, where he was an investigator and policy researcher. Our point of contact, Elson is a former Queen's College student, studied political science and economics at Amherst College in Western Massachusetts, and has an anti-money laundering and anti-corruption certificate from the International Law Institute. He's worked at Goldman Sachs and Company for 2 years before returning to Guyana. And finally, Mr. Joel Bagwandin, financial and economic analyst, academic researcher, writer, lecturer, thought leader, Joel, as many of you know, is actively engaged in providing insights and analyses on and economic issues in Guyana for the past 5 years and some. He's authored more than 300 articles covering a variety of thematic areas, and Joel possesses more than 14 years of experience in the financial sector and the private sector development combined. So I want to welcome you all to this program, and I want to, in a sense, before I invite David to say a few words, I want to frame the conversation that I want us to have around transparency and accountability in the emerging oil and gas sector in Guyana.
Professor, before you move on,
Yes.
are you streaming live anywhere? I'm not seeing anything on the Facebook page.
It should be bummer. It says I just noted. It says we're having some trouble streaming to Facebook. So let's see. So it's live. So we've been having some difficulties with Facebook. I've noted in the last two programs or so there've been some, but it is streaming live on the Hopin service and on YouTube. And I've actually, sorry to have this part of it. I've actually been having a real thought about the ongoing use of Facebook as an effective tool. That it's now become extremely crowded, and many hackers and many sorts of individuals so. It's streaming on the Facebook page, and it's not on the Facebook page, but on the Hopin page and on the YouTube page. So I'll share the YouTube on Facebook in a moment. So what I wanted to do was to frame the conversation before we kind of entered into the dialogue, which was to say that part of what as the Guyana Business Journal, I mean, part of what we're thinking about is, ways in which we can help Guyana to be more attractive to investors. We think that this is the way forward, and what we want to kind of really emphasize in this program is the sense in which transparency and accountability costs Guyana money. There's a premium, there's a risk premium that is attached to broadly speaking corruption, and so the less corruption you have, the more likely it is that people are willing to invest, and the cost of borrowing money for investing in places that are less corrupt is less. And,
Amen.
And so what this means is that part of what we want to kind of emphasize here for our Guyanese colleagues is the importance of this aspect. So I will invite David to help to set the stage, and then I will take a moment to share the YouTube link to our on Facebook. David?
Wonderful, Terence. Good morning, everybody. Our
morning.
Colleagues here on the session and the audience we have in Guyana, across the Americas, and internationally joining us. I think you hit it right on the nail, and it really has to do with the critical importance of Guyana as it positions itself as an attractive market for investment, not just foreign direct investment, but national and regional investment across sectors, not just the oil and gas sector, but all the ancillary sectors that are growing in Guyana as a result: manufacturing, agribusiness, infrastructure, construction, real estate, hospitality. And the importance of, as the famous mantra of doing business reports now, where transparency, anti-corruption initiatives, accountability are so high up on the agenda in terms of markets that investors look at to be stable, even when you have the 800 million pound gorilla like Exxon in your country, because that does not cover everything. A major investor like Exxon brings in global best practices, rule of law requirements like those of Foreign Agents Corrupt Practices Act in the US, the same with European firms, but it doesn't cover everything. At the end of the day, these have to be locally grown and executed initiatives. And as I've mentioned so often in our 16 programs, in Guyana, across the board, this is work in progress. We have to remember that for over 4 decades, Guyana was running a closed, semi-socialist type economy, which actually did not look kindly upon foreign investment or national investment or the private sector and private capital. So these things are new. But I always mention institutions matter. And in that sense, the creation of public sector, private sector, civil society institutions focusing on transparency, accountability, anti-corruption initiatives are critical in terms of setting up the systemic checks and balances which you mentioned, Terence. And this is not just the role of government. Government is important because it is the de jure formal arbiter of business in a country, of the entrance of companies, and of regulating by law how those companies perform, and making sure that the public sector is up to standard as well. But it also has to do with what the private sector does at the individual corporate level in different sectors, and the role of civil society, the media, the importance of media focusing on what transparency is, what accountability is, and so on. And all this comes to the forefront because it means you are meeting certain minimum global best practices of doing business, which move you into a certain mapping across the globe of types of countries. Or are you a toxic country to do business in, and therefore the risks are very high? The payout may be very high, but then the risk is very high, like certain countries across Africa, for example, or unfortunately now some in our neighborhood in the Americas, not far from Guyana. And what that does to drive away private capital, both local and foreign, and the negative effect that has on the entire political economy system. And finally, as you mentioned, there's an economic premium, a risk attached to this, which people in the Central Bank of Guyana, in the ministry, in Treasury, in the government, feel and see as they move around the world, talking to businesses in terms of saying Guyana is ready for business in your area. Let me just close out, and I know our colleagues will focus more on this. We have initiatives in Guyana already, which are growing, work in progress, as I say. The setup of a Transparency International organization in country, and the Guyana's participation in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which has had certain ups and downs, but basically is the key global organization for countries with mining business, grosso modo, not just oil and gas, but all having to do with extractive industries. And this is critically important because that's sort of the label in that sector. And given that right now this is the bulk of the economic activity in Guyana, it's very important that we get that part right and use that as a jumping block, if you will, for the other areas of the economy, which, while they may be smaller in volume and scope, as Joel and Elson will point out, they are covering much more of the economic activity and the population in Guyana than the oil and gas sector. So we need to make sure that they do not lag behind and that they move up at the same speed or close to the same speed as the oil and gas sector. So let me stop there, set that as the framework, and then listen to our colleagues. Thank you again, Terence, and welcome, everybody.
Thank you, David. And so today we're fortunate to be joined by Ambassador Michael Skull, who, as I indicated in his bio, has a tremendous amount of experience in this area. And so, Ambassador Skull, let me invite you to talk about some of these transparency mechanisms and some of the work that you've been doing. Ambassador Skull.
Thank you, Terence. Thank you, David. It's an honor, really, to be invited to speak about a country that I have not known much about in the past. It is it's the only country in South America I have not visited or lived in, and maybe we can change that someday. Let me begin with two basic points. This is a period of rising pressure and rising penalties for corruption and money laundering. Investors are placing an ever higher premium on sending their money to places which can demonstrate their clean credentials. You may note that fines of less than $1 billion don't usually anymore make the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And fines now are being applied to individuals as well as companies. So the penalties, the injuries incurred on malefactors, people who are in companies, countries that are involved in corruption, are growing more and more, and therefore the need to do something about it is growing. The other basic point I want to make is that Guyana in particular has a unique and obvious nearby example of what it must not be. Venezuela today is arguably the most corrupt country in the Western Hemisphere, possibly the world. Guyana can profit by showing it is not Venezuela. Now, I can go into detail. I can send you a dozen webinars about what's going on in Venezuela today, but I suspect that you know all about the very sad and tragic recent history of Venezuela. But I know you keep Venezuela in mind for certain other reasons, but look and think about Venezuela and the incredible, I'm telling you, incredible corruption that has grown up there. Corruption has become the mantra, the way of doing business in Venezuela. And if anybody wants to do something, just check on how Venezuela is doing it and reverse that by 180 degrees, and you might come up with a reasoned policy. Now, I should add that I personally am in no position to critique in detail Guyana's existing transparency or anti-corruption system. That would require an extensive, on-the-ground investigation. I have not, in fact, as I mentioned, ever visited your country, and I hope to someday. So my comments here will be more of a general nature, except for what has appeared in print from certain global institutions, as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which you have mentioned. Now, my years in the anti-corruption business, which included my last several years in the U.S. Foreign Service, have convinced me that corruption, as defined today, is in fact the natural state of human existence. Now, I know we can debate this, it's philosophical, but I've seen it over and over again. It is where countries, institutions, and others automatically find themselves, barring rigorous efforts by the highest authorities to stand. Some countries have done it. It's been done. It's possible. But it requires an almost unusual combination of the highest elected or any kind of official, the opposition, the people, and the media, everyone together are generally what's required to maintain a viable anti-corruption system. Now, listen, I grew up in Chicago, so I know firsthand what pervasive corruption looks like, and I know all about the justifications that people make for corruption. I think statements like, "Well, it's necessary to grease the wheels. We've got to do this. We've got." I'm very familiar with that kind of argument, and my comment on that I don't mention on webinars because I would be canceled. But there is no question that corruption seriously devalues any project or ministry or service it touches, and the people pay the price. Just look once more at Venezuela, if you can stand it. Now, we all know that Guyana now faces that test. The burgeoning of oil and gas is once in a 500-year occurrence for any people, for any country, and it's an opportunity, and we better not look back on it 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now and say, look at the opportunity that was missed. The recent record is mixed. Guyana made significant improvement in the Corruption Perceptions Index from 2012 to 2022, and some in what they call the benchmark worldwide governance indicators from 2015 to 2021. Guyana now stands halfway between Denmark, which is number 1, and South Sudan, which is 209. But a fairly low overall score achieved in implementing the 2019 standard. The current anti-corruption review, the 6th round under the so-called Mechanism for the Implementation of the OAS Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, MESICIC. How do you pronounce the MESICIC? But listen, it's very, very important. I believe it is incumbent upon the government, the people, the media, the opposition to look carefully, excuse me, at the lessons, follow the recommendation, and raise the standard. But I would follow that with a word of caution. Statements by governments, officials, the creation of committees, claimed commitments are not enough. More must be done to make sure the corrections are indeed implemented and kept alive. There are many, many recognized compilations of recognized compliance elements, some embodied in international standards, as the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, recommendations on money laundering, which are very, very clear, are expanded every couple of years, and against which countries are regularly judged. And if you're on the FATF, that's FATF, the FATF blacklist, your cost of borrowing automatically goes up. It's an extraordinarily powerful international tool. And then there are the laws and rules related to the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and parallel laws. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was the first of its kind, but many countries in the West, Japan and others, have enacted very, very similar laws, some even stronger, and it's interesting to look at what the courts say when someone is accused of violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They ask such things as, is there a compliance department in your company? Does it have real force? Does the president, does the line of command regularly make clear to all employees the importance of fighting corruption? That is, can they be fired? There's a whole list of items that if a company does, then the penalty or the jail term can be reduced. Another powerful tool. But let me suggest another kind of mechanism that has proven effective in very many parts of the world, including within the United States. That is the decision to place in the hands of some individual or organization outside the government, and very often outside the country, a significant part of the direction over and judgment about the effort. It creates a distance, in other words, between the local political and other influence on the one hand, and the way the decision-making process is made on the other. There are various ways to do that. Let me start with the most dramatic, the most severe, and that is something called IPSIG, IPSIG. That's the Independent Private Sector Inspector General. This is a system some years ago. These are global big companies that get themselves on the list. They are selected at random. It's a very interesting process. If you say you want an IPSIG to govern your industry or this project or that project, the international body then picks the top of that list, and you get that company. You have no choice in picking that company, and that IPSIG then takes over legally. There has to be an agreement. A great deal of the decision-making process, accounting, investigative works. They have the authority to bring judgments against others. The government have the final say, but the IPSIG provides the kind of independent guarantee which can give investors and the people the confidence that there are guardrails in place to assure their monies are being used properly. And again, this is a severe kind of effort. Most countries wouldn't go that far. In some countries, the laws wouldn't even allow them to go that far. So another way of doing much the same thing is the use of a respected private global compliance firm to assume these same kinds of duties, but without this strict legal framework of an IPSIG. This is a company that can analyze the situation, design an appropriate compliance system, and help maintain the operation. Now, there are variations of this. There's something called procurement monitoring. There's price verification. These are companies that go to the origin of products, whatever it is, coming into your country to make sure that the price that's being charged to your company or government is the actual price that was engaged in at the origin. There's a pre-shipment inspection. There's investigative due diligence. The net effect of what I'm talking about, this external monitoring or companion monitoring, has invariably been the saving of substantial amounts of money. I've seen reports that, for example, in the IPSIG, the costs of engaging in IPSIG have been substantially less than the amounts of monies that the IPSIG saves the contracting company. Hopefully, and I think that's right. But it also provides the country, the government, the company, a very convincing ally if and when there is an accusation of wrongdoing, because you lift the economic decision-making out of the realm strictly of local politics and personality. And it's a very powerful tool. Somebody accuses the government of, well, you look what you did here. You allowed this payment to go forward, and it's illicit. And you can say, this international, this global firm, or this IPSIG, or somebody, we counted on them, and that is a very powerful argument, because then you get, in effect, legal support from a company that doesn't want to lose its reputation, its image for probity. Okay, let me go quickly through a couple of other things. The role of technology. The science, as we all know, has advanced at an incredible rate. the ability to trace such issues as beneficial ownership. Now, as you all know, beneficial ownership is the latest buzzword, and you got to find out who really owns the money, going all the way back to whether it was Adam or Eve that signed the original check. The technology allows all kinds of investigations, but my warning to companies and to governments is that there's another side to this. Artificial intelligence, in particular, has enabled the other side, the corrupt, the money launderers, the hackers, to advance, frankly, even faster than the defense. Now, I am not an advanced technological expert, but I've watched this over time. And I know that the gap between the attack, whatever it is, the hacking, and the defense against the attack, the gap is widening. And I don't know what is happening, how far it will go. I'm very worried about it all. I have advised certain clients that they better get their a new supply of fountain pens and pocket calculators, just in case. And then the transparency. We all know about how important transparency, making everything as public as possible. It should be obvious that bidding requirements, details of the bids themselves, names, locations of company, of officers involved, reasons for acceptance or denial of a bid or proposal, open it all up so that the information can be checked and confirmed. It's a very, very, very important. And if you're afraid to make it public, there may be a reason for it. So if you have not made something public, someone can say, but why didn't you report the fact that your new vice president for administrative details and now makes $6 million a year? Well, we didn't. The point is that the more you report, the less you have to defend against. I think that we have learned not automatically to trust that monies will not be pilfered. It is incumbent on Guyana in the present circumstances to demonstrate that you can be trusted from the outset, from right now. That would be the best investment of all. And I am optimistic that would happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it is incumbent on us to really demonstrate that we can be trusted. And I perhaps want to invite Elson to give us his sense of how well are we, how well can we be trusted? I mean, give us a sense of, from your perspective, of the accountability, transparency and accountability practices in industry. How well are our regulatory bodies working? How well do we have the kind of oversight in our governance practices? Give us a sense, a more local sense of how well we can be trusted.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, let me say I'm very pleased to be here, Mrs. Skull. Very informative presentation. Since I was at SAR, I haven't heard words like Sifatef and Mesisik and so on, but we were steeped in that kind of engagement. And in fact, at SARA, the IDB is actually who trained me on oil and gas matters, and especially with regard to corruption. Of course, Mr. Blackman would have mentioned my certificate in anti-corruption and anti-money laundering. There was a heavy focus on the oil and gas industry. And indeed, there was a heavy focus on audits, the oil audits that you're going to have in your oil industry regarding your cost oil. And that has provided some insight for what we'll, I think, discuss a bit today. Now, folks, really what I'll do is I'll share with you a couple of vignettes, little tastes that when you put them together will give you, I think, a very comprehensive sense of some of the challenges we face. One of the things that I would say that I find to be interesting, I've been expressing to some various economists and other senior people that I speak to, many of whom reside abroad, is that in Guyana we find that there are things that are uncontroversial, things that are controversial. That is to say, we lack sometimes, so we don't do the basics to such an extent that it becomes an element of controversy, and it requires or becomes a major media issue. And as a result, it continues to cast the country in a light which is negative and which raises serious concerns regarding corruption. And so, from that perspective, when we lean into some of these vignettes, I think we can contrast them with what might be best practice anywhere in the world, but really in countries where they take corruption seriously, where they deal with transparency and accountability in a very serious way. And we must just juxtapose that with what's going on again and ask ourselves, first of all, why, but second of all, what can be done. And I'll give you just a last note as to what I think can be done to help to improve that particular area of governance in Guyana, where we've got, I think, some serious questions. Now, the first thing I'll bring up, and maybe something that many of you haven't thought about that much, but in the PSA itself, it's indicated that wherever there is excess natural gas available, there must be a feasibility study conducted. Now, of course, Guyana is leveraging that same natural gas for a gas to energy project, a project which in some respects will cost the country something like $2 billion US dollars. So quite a substantial project. Now, a little while ago, a reporter from a local newspaper had asked the company why they haven't done the feasibility study, and the company responded that there's no excess gas and therefore no study required. Now, that shocked the entire nation because people were thinking to themselves, could there be that there's no gas, there's no natural gas, and we're spending 2 billion US on a natural gas power energy project? That's crazy. So we in the opposition had to issue an immediate statement calling on the company to clarify the situation. And of course, they did come out and say that they will be able to provide natural gas. But the reason that there was such confusion is that the feasibility study that was supposed to have been conducted, that the PSA itself says should be conducted, was not conducted. Now, again, I put it to you this way. It seems to me that it is not controversial that if the contract that you have with a company says that the company must conduct a study, that the company would be made to conduct the study. That's uncontroversial. How did that become a controversy? But yeah, we're starting off here, but that's $2 billion we've started off the conversation with. Now we look across at the appointment of the Chancellor and the Chief Justice. In order for you to have transparency and accountability, you have to have a legal system in which there is the appropriate safeguards, and having a permanent Chancellor and Chief Justice is one safeguard that political science says that you must have in place so that those officials do not feel vulnerable or cannot be influenced. That particular appointment controversy has been dragging on for, about a year and a half now, in which the leader of the opposition, as is required by the Constitution, has given his assent for the current Chancellor and Chief Justice to move from an acting role to a permanent role. Now, when the administration is approached about this, they say, it's not that we're without a Chancellor and Chief Justice. They're able to act. But, of course, that is not the way that they're supposed to be acting in order to ensure that we have a robust legal system. And you've even heard officials as high as the CCJ say that this is an untenable situation and this appointment must be dealt with. Now, when you look at whatever laws the government might want to introduce regarding transparency and accountability, if they don't deal with something as significant as the most senior legal officials in the country, then you're undermining every single law that you'll introduce, and there's a question of enforcement. Now, of course, previous point, I mentioned that they didn't enforce the need for a feasibility study for that gas, and that created a problem. Now we've got the legal system as a whole in a serious mire. Additionally, those are two areas just to give you a flavor of it. But the real area that I think has caught the national attention. I'm sure many of your viewers will want to hear about, and which was referenced a little earlier, is the issue of Guyana's oil audits. Now, I think any reasonable spectator, anyone from another country would agree that if it is that you're supposed to conduct audits to ensure that what you've been charged for oil expenses, oil development expenses, production expenses, and so on, is true and appropriate and so on, that it wouldn't be controversial that you should conduct the audit. Now, and this actually originated under my previous time on the previous leader of the opposition, where Christopher Ram came out to say the government's attitude towards the oil audits was nonchalant, and where there was considerable concern. You saw several media articles coming out around Guyana's not auditing these oil companies, and in fact allowing audit deadlines to lapse with the excuse that there wasn't capacity. Now we're talking about billions and billions of US being involved in these audits. It is no excuse to say that you don't have capacity. You have to go and get the capacity because of the amount of money that's involved. Now, if you're looking at the first audit, where 214 million US, that's an audit commissioned by the coalition government, is in question, and where there's apparently now going to be a serious dispute and arbitration over it. The next audit was at $7 billion, and if you look at a fraction of that, I think it's like 13% of that, you're getting into the hundreds and hundreds of millions of US that could be in question. These are serious matters, and they must be dealt with seriously. Now, that audit, because that deadline was going to lapse, and then, of course, the deadline did lapse. You saw myself saying it should be a criminal offense not to audit. You saw various members of the opposition pointing out the serious losses that could have accrued. And that was all the way back at the beginning of 2022. Now, that saga has dragged on and has continued to paint Guyana in a negative light as it concerns transparency and accountability. Again, in any country, the best practice, what would not be controversial, is that you should audit, and that you should audit on time. How is that controversial? But here we have a controversy. Now, as the audit issue continued on, I spoke on the need to release these audits, need to make clear to the public what is going on. And I had to say that it should be a criminal offense to hide the results of an audit. Lo and behold, Starbrook News is able to leak the results or the initial results of the IHS market audit. And there's 214 million US in that audit that they say that we can reclaim, that the government has been in possession of for, I think it's 2 to 3 years at this point. Now, that I think really raised a lot of people's concerns, because why weren't we aware that this audit had been handed over to the government and that these amounts had been sitting there for all this time? Why hadn't the government said anything? And what is going to happen regarding future audits? Now, you may think that this little vignette, it can't get any worse than that, but lo and behold, it gets worse, because now we're hearing that the $214 million was reduced to $3 million, or something that was announced by the vice president at one of his press conferences, something that was announced to us in the opposition when we met with Exxon, confidently, that it's been reduced to $3 million. Then all of a sudden you hear that, no, it's not $3 million. Rather, the GRA wants to stick to this $214 million, and people are asking, well, where did the government get the $3 million figure from? And in particular, where did the oil company get the confidence in the $3 million figure from? Does this imply that senior people were involved when they perhaps shouldn't have been involved? That, of course, again raises the question of transparency and accountability, because if everything was transparent, then we wouldn't have had all of these controversies, these concerns, these questions, these fears. Both Starbrook and Kitro coming out with scathing editorials on this issue regarding the government. And now we've seen that the government has mentioned that a particular individual within the Ministry of Natural Resources was acting in an unauthorized fashion. That's what the government is saying. But essentially, in order for that to have been the case, and we go back to accountability, because former President Ramatara said he can't understand that no one has lost their job over this, even political officials, I would hope, are included in that. Because really, in order for senior officials in the government not to have known that this particular individual was involved in anything and that GRA was not involved, it would mean that they were reading reports, listening to what he had to say, listening to what others had to say. And they never asked a single question when Guyana's audit amount was due, moved from 240 million US to 3 million US. They didn't ask about the process. They didn't ask who was involved. They didn't ask why it was that it was removed. Because any question would immediately have yielded that the GRA was not involved. It would have been obvious. So that raises the second question, which is, I mean, what is that? Extreme negligence? So it is either you believe it was extreme negligence, or you believe that there is potentially some criminal or corrupt activity involved. And that is something that we need to continue to see investigated so that we have the truth here. Now, I say all this to say that this all stems from something which is uncontroversial, which is that you should audit and audit on time, which is that you should have transparency, accountability, basic good governance involved. It didn't have to come to this, a massive multi-year crisis with probably 100 news articles calling it out, multiple editorials, people in serious concern. Was that necessary? No, it was not necessary. And so I say that in Guyana, sometimes the simple things that are causing all of this controversy. I close, to give some perspective. Now, if we had had a petroleum commission in place, that is not a political commission. That is a commission which is structured. That is a commission which lays out a process, an audit process, and lays out clear mechanisms regarding transparency, clear timelines regarding that audit process. This would have been a non-issue. And so from that perspective, I think the way forward is for the Petroleum Commission, which the government has promised but not put in place, to be established so that we can move these issues into a space where, number one, they're not political actors hovering over them, but number two, we can have established processes and structures in place so that transparency and accountability really are dealt with the way that they should be dealt with. And so I think you can pick up from the tone of my voice. I'm disappointed that these uncontroversial things have become such controversies and issues. But sadly, am I surprised? Perhaps not.
Well, thank you, Joel. I mean, I think that I think also what you've raised are these questions of you've identified in some real way sort of political risk emanating from the lack of transparency and accountability. I think you've identified some legal risk, and so certainly this is an issue in terms of, you know, from the business perspective, the property rights protections, contract rights. I think you've identified quite clearly some economic risks, and you know, you've raised in part some of the issues that go to the extractive industries protocol and the auditing that is necessary in this context. And so my question for Joel, kind of joining these two things, is do we need an IPSIC, Joel? You know.
All right. So thank you.
Just to understand. Yes.
Yeah. Am I being heard?
Yes, you're being heard fine.
All right. So thank you. We've had some very good presentations by your opening remarks that set the stage, David, Ambassador Skull, in a more generic sense, and then my colleague Elson Lowe bringing an opposition perspective on selective issues. Well, let me take a step back and bring some important context, drawing from the background that you have established, as well as Ambassador Skull, where Ambassador Skull mentioned briefly about the overarching EML framework. He referenced the international FATF and CFATF framework. And if we to go down a little bit into history, I want to establish that over the years, we have made improvements in terms of our overall anti-corruption architecture in terms of governance, transparency, and accountability. One would recall that in the pre-2015 era, when we had a new political dispensation for the first time after a few decades, where we had a minority government and you had the combined opposition had control of the National Assembly by way of a one-seat majority. You had a situation of deadlock, which resulted in bills not being passed, budgets not being approved, or budgets being cut by the opposition. And we were in a critical juncture at that time where we were placed on the gray list that Ambassador Skull referenced, not the blacklist. The blacklist come with a whole set of different ramifications. And so we were placed on the gray list, and then after the gray list, you hit the blacklist. Now, that would have been detrimental for the country had we gone to the blacklist. Now, so that all of that necessitated the need for snap elections in 2015. And that then helped us to come out of that. The government at that time, move ahead with their amendments to the legislation and so on. But it is more than to understand our EML architecture, anti-corruption architecture. It's more than just looking at the issue from a specific issue. You got to understand broadly the entire framework, the entire structure. And we have recently been assessed, and this is not my assessment, this is an assessment by the International Monetary Fund that has acknowledged the improvement made in terms of in a broader sense. Right now, the country is undergoing the assessment by the CFATF body, which is a branch of the FATF, which is the international architecture. So, and then you have the Transparency Institute, their report, and so on. One point I want to make about Ambassador Skull made reference to the global indexes, and David made reference to the global index. One point that I want to make about the Transparency Institute reports, for instance, is that the index, and Troy, who is far more familiar with this more than me, could correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that inform their index is they look at countries and they assess the country based on their recommendations. So if the country failed to implement their recommendation, for example, in terms of they might make a suggestion in terms of reporting on data deficiencies or reporting discrepancies, and that has not been fixed because it requires investment in technology or an ICT framework, that the failure to implement their recommendation and not necessarily compliance with the law that govern the particular sector or the guidelines or the regulations, that is one of the things that inform their recommendation. Now, coming back to the risks factor, which was the opening remark, that these risks affect international investors' view of a country, whether they could trust us enough to place their capital to invest in the country. And the evidence would dispute the narrative that there is a lack of trust, because the evidence, on the other hand, is such that investments, both domestic investments as well as foreign investment, aside from the oil and gas sector, you have foreign investments, you have regional coming in from the region and all across the globe are coming into the country with strong interests, and some of which have manifested. And so we are at a point in this country for the first time in our history where investors' confidence is is sky high. And we got to put that into context and put it in the context from where we came from again. There was an era when investors' confidence in this country, both domestically and internationally, was not where it is today. And that was as a result of the political risk as well, the political risk associated with the country at that time. Today, the political risk, I would say, is modest or moderate. I wouldn't say necessarily low or necessarily high, but we're somewhere there in the middle, and that is good from that standpoint. Now, having said that, and the numbers would show that. Now let's come to some specific issues that my colleague would have referenced. One of the things that we have to appreciate about transparency and accountability is that accepting responsibility is a key caveat or a fundamental facet of accountability. Accepting responsibility. And credit to the government of the day, those specific examples presented by Al-Sanlo, case in point, the 214 million audit. The government has accepted responsibility. Now let's take a step back for a moment and understand what has happened, which my colleague, conveniently spoke about it from his perspective, and he has a right to do that. But the important fact is that in relation to the audit in terms of capacity building, we agree that we want to build our local capacity. In terms of the time frame to get the audit done, those of you and those persons who are familiar with how audits are done, the traditional audits for a non-oil and gas company, take for example a Banks DIH or a Starling or a DDL, the process takes about 6 months to wrap it up, from the initiation to the wrap it up. And those audits, and those are let's say 101 of these companies that I named. Let's say for example DDL, their annual turnover is about 100 million US dollars. A company like that size takes about 6 months to wrap up, and it is not 100%. They don't audit, and it's a different type of audit. The cost oil audit, on the other hand, as we all know, it's to the tune of billions of US dollars, and it is not done by way of sample size. It's 100%. So if an audit, a type of audit that we have decades of experience, takes 6 months, then obviously an audit of this nature, which is new to us, but we can build the capacity quickly, would take longer than 6 months. Now, these are the practical considerations. I'm not getting political here or using politically convenient narrative, but these are the practical reality, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing in relation to this particular audit is that an audit, and again, those who are familiar with audit, whether it's cost oil or whether it's a regular audit for another company, the process is pretty much the same, where it's an iterative process. There would be deficiencies, there will be various draft reports, and all of that before an audit is concluded. And if we are to go back and to fact check this sequence of events, you would find that the vice president had said that the GRA is the authority on the authoritative body in respect of the audit. The ministry has no authority to pronounce on audit because the ministry doesn't have audit capacity neither. The function of the ministry is to coordinate and to facilitate. And so at the point when the report hit the media, at that stage when the report first hit the media, the audit was not concluded. They were still in their draft stages. And the fact that we have acknowledged in the beginning that when we speak of accountability and transparency for a country, everybody and every institution have a role to play, including media, including civil society, including the established institutions and including the political opposition of the day. So the fact that that report went to the media, the government did not shy away from the government took responsibility. So it means our systems of accountability and transparency is working. When it comes to the specific issue, what the government, as far as the government is concerned, what they have acknowledged, and what I have also, from my observation, is that we need to strengthen our capacity. And Terence, you made the point earlier about checks and balances. There is no doubt about that. And we're not shy about that. We need to strengthen our capacity and strengthen our checks and balances. Now, if one looks at the production chain agreement, for instance, there are a number of things in there that, from a regulatory standpoint, to ensure Exxon, the oil companies, they report on data, they submit their reporting. There are a set of things that have to happen on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, that we certainly need to improve on. Now, the Petroleum Commission, yes, the function of a Petroleum Commission is to regulate the industry. But in this particular instance, in this particular scenario, one has to question whether the Petroleum Commission would have been effective, because what has happened here is not what happens traditionally and evidently in other countries, where you have these deficiencies, or what has happened here, it falls on the politicians. But here, this discrepancy was occurred by the technicians rather than the politicians. And it was the politician and the media that aided in this to happen. And so the position on that matter, it remains the 214 million, which is the disputed figure, that has to go to arbitration. So certainly we have to deal with that and sort that out. But that is not the only benchmark to now assess the overall framework. When you have all the other institutions are working, you have a government that is subjecting itself to public scrutiny and public accountability, and which, if we are to look at a contrast of that in the past, you had the case with the signing bonus, for example, and you had the government denying that a signing bonus was received. And on top of that, you had other laws were violated. The Fiscal Management and Accountability Act was violated, because the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act establishes that you have to establish a deposit fund. The minister has to do certain things. He has to report to the National Assembly, and all the ministers denied. Contrast that to this situation. You have the government owning up and taking responsibility, and we need to acknowledge that as well as a huge facet of accountability, which we haven't seen, a government doing so in the recent past. So, and then finally, on the legal issue with the chancellor, that's, my colleague was not being totally honest. He's partially honest on that issue, because the fact that we have an acting chancellor and an acting chief justice, it does not pose a legal risk, because we have been in that dispensation for decades. And from where I sit, I'm actively involved in the private sector. I deal with foreign investors. I deal with local investors here. I have a company, and so on. The legal system works. The judiciary of the judicial arm of the state is functioning, and it's working, because you have the High Court, you have the Appeal Court, you have the Caribbean Court of Justice. Despite you having these officers functioning in an acting capacity. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but one of the things he failed to acknowledge is that there is another critical piece of the institutional mechanism that has a role to play in that regard, which is the Judicial Service Commission, right? So there is no legal risk from an investor standpoint where that matter is concerned, and that is a totally different matter. If investors had no confidence in the legal system overall, then that would have been a problem. But that is not the case, and that is a fact, right? So I'll pause there for now, and I'll leave the floor open for
Yeah.
other.
So
Uh,
yeah, thanks, Joel. I think you've at least allowed you framed from the other side the some ways in which one can interpret this political risk, this legal risk, this economic risk, and certainly I think we don't want to go away. I looked at the risk charts for, as Ambassador Skull mentioned. I think we are. Venezuela is 10 times more risky than Guyana. So Guyana, as he rightly said, sits halfway between Sudan and Norway. So we don't want to go with the sense that we're a basket case. We're not a basket case, and we're growing. The question is for how we can grow faster in this arena of how we can somehow subsume some of our instincts to secrecy and begin to see that transparency has much more value to us in this moment. Our tendency, perhaps our cultural tendency, is towards acting in smaller groups, towards minimizing the sharing of information broadly. And we're now in a world which requires us to, in order for us to get it right, to share things broadly. And so in a sense, that's what the conversation is aiming at. We're not blaming. We're identifying that there's some challenges. We're identifying that there are some ways in which we are getting better, and the issue is, can we get better faster? And so I wanted to ask Dr. Troy Thomas, from his perspective as a former president of the sum up what you've heard. My specific question that I wanted to bring to you was more broadly to connect the transparency and accountability to broader inclusion. So that's where I'd like you to end up. But you can go in any direction given what you've heard at this moment and given what resonates with you, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you. And I will say to begin that a lot of the issues we've been discussing have been around for some time in one form or another. What I would like for all sides of the debate to consider is that in the crossfire, we have the citizens. And I want to underscore this issue of the well being of our citizens. Often we speak in economic terms, economic growth, and so forth. And I believe that you can have growth, but not necessarily distribution. And so growth can speak to how well we've performed for a few people in society. But if we talk about well-being of the citizens, we're talking about more broad development, and well-being involves a variety of issues. When I think about inclusivity, there is a natural connection to transparency and accountability, but I want to frame it as part of our democracy contract. And I was happy to find that Article 13 of the Constitution takes care of this because it allows me to avoid a philosophical overview of the matter. So I don't have to give you an overview of what democracy is and how all of this ties into it. What I can point to is that we believe that it was so important that we saw it necessary to enshrine certain principles in our constitution, which is part of our democracy contract. And it must be because At our core, as a nation, we believe in it. And Article 13, if I read it quickly, I have it on my screen, says the principal objective of the political system of the state is to establish an inclusionary democracy by providing increasing opportunities for the participation of citizens and their organizations in the management and decision-making process of the state, with particular emphasis on those areas of decision-making that directly affect their well-being. And if I think about that, it encompasses this whole thing. We're talking about inclusionary democracy. It's alluding there to protection of minority rights, ensuring that the majority does not become, or the plurality in power, as the case might be, does not become the big bad bully that can override minority rights or treat us as if we are uh, a single homogenous group that a certain fraction can speak on behalf of as a whole. And that's so it's sort of backstopping. It's a preemptive strike against populism. It's a preemptive strike against authoritarianism, which a majority can actually devolve into once they have the reins of power. It is reminding us that we have to cater for those smaller groups that might not have the political power to change something themselves. The system has got to cater for them. It's also saying participation of citizens is very important in the decision making of the state, and especially anything that involves their well being. When you think about the petroleum sector and about the potential for the revenues or whatever we generate from there to have impacts on the economy, impacts on development, and so forth, we're seeing that it can have impacts on the well-being of citizens if we were to manage it appropriately. And how can we manage it appropriately? That article tells me that we anticipate that citizens must be involved in the decision making. We anticipate that citizens' organizations must have access to the decision making process and to be able to make meaningful input. Now, what is it that allows citizens to do all of that? They have to know what is going on. The only way you know what is going on is through transparency.
Sir.
So we need transparency. It's sort of the underlying issue that ties all of this together and will allow us to achieve Article 13, which is part of our democracy contract. We as a nation thought that it's so important that we enshrined it in the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. And so we now have to put things in place to achieve that. Next thing this article says is that it says increasing opportunities for participation. And that tells me we're not fulfilling the contract if there is participation. It must be something that's going from one level to the next. So we have to find ways to continually improve participation of citizens if we want to achieve this. And so that tells me a lot, and it sort of frames the whole thing for me. And so transparency, accountability should not seem like anything strange. In fact, if we're not doing it, we're not doing our jobs as citizens. And so apart from the side where we can demand, however, opportunities for participation and so forth, we also have to find opportunities to be creative, to find new ways of participating. So it's not only, in my view, a weight on the government. Citizens also have to create ways of participating and perhaps finding new modes of engaging and having the impact that is necessary. I want to say one thing specifically about this before I move to the next point. Showing up once every 5 years and voting is the minimum you can do. You can't go lower than that in terms of participation and still call ourselves a democracy. Because to be a democracy, we have to have a decision-making process where we count those votes. So if we do that, and all that we do as citizens is show up and vote for our leaders, and we do nothing else, we don't get involved beyond that, we are on the floor, we're at zero basically. We're just breaking even to say, yes, this is a democracy. We're not achieving anything beyond that. History will tell us that we can't leave all these decisions up to our leaders. And it seems that as a nation, we recognize that. That's why Article 13 is there. We, as a diverse society, we have different experiences. We live in different parts of the country. We come from different households. We have different desires, different dreams, different perspectives. If we're all going to have or experience improvement in well-being, all of that experience has to come into the pool so that we can find ways of addressing everything that needs to be addressed. And so as citizens, we have to participate. And I don't think it's only a selection of a diverse group. It's also reaching. So coverage, in addition to sometimes we might select, but we have to cover the length and breadth of the country. So I want to advocate strongly for the well-being of the citizens to become the benchmark by which we evaluate what we're achieving. I hear about GDP and growth and so forth, but those things can, in a context where there is inequality, those things can mean very different, can allude to very different outcomes. So I want to, if we were to focus on the well-being of the citizens, I think that is something, if we're moving that along, and if revenues from the oil sector is allowing us to move the needle in terms of well-being of citizens, I think then we're doing something right. Oil is a scarce resource. It's a natural resource. And so what I would say here is relevant to all natural resources. It will run out at some point. And that brings the issue of intergenerational justice into play as well, because it's not only for us here and now, because when it runs out, the next generation and the generation after that doesn't have anything to go on. So in our planning, we got to make sure that we're catering for them as well. And so our participation is not only to see what economic gains we can maximize right here and now, we also have to be thinking beyond that. And so I think we also have to have values infused into our management. This is one of my criticisms of the Natural Resource Fund Act. It focuses so much on experts in business and finance and management and so forth. And we don't see, how do we get society's values in there? It does not seem to be an important element of it. But when we're talking about managing something where we have to think about intergenerational justice, values become important, not only the economic issues of the present. And that's a criticism I would make of the current act that we have. Now, transparency is essential for accountability, because if you can't see what is happening, you don't know what is happening, what would you hold anybody accountable for? All right. And then there is accountability in terms of policy. What are the policies that we want to see implemented? And that will be because of how we view our society and where it's going. There's accountability for performance of government overall, for running a clean government. For economic gains, there is accountability for a whole host of things. So when we're talking about accountability, we're talking about it broadly, not only checking to see whether the laws have been followed. That's important. But part of it is that our leaders must be allowing or enabling society to progress as well. But for all of that, we need the information. And this is one area where I think we're weak. In part, it is rooted in our historic lack of resources, and we have not put the infrastructure down to ensure that we have the kind of data that we need. Part of it, I think, is almost cultural, the way we look at data, how we regard it. Data sharing, for example. We have data, but we might not be putting it in useful formats. Like, try to copy something from the laws of Guyana on any of those websites. It's locked. You have to retype something if you want. Why? Why is that necessary? Um, and things like those give us a window into how we're thinking about these things. Like, we're fearful, perhaps, of manipulation, but then you always have the original source. We have to cater for that so that when people say something, we can pull up. But anyway, that's just an illusion. That's just a side issue I want to make. I want to raise to say that sometimes our mindset gets in the way of what data we collect, how we collect it, how we store it, and whether or not we share it. But that is essential for transparency. And so that's something we need to think about, acknowledging that we have had resource constraints, but I think now we have to make a deliberate effort. The kind of money my colleagues were talking about earlier, that's no small change, right? That's things you really need strong systems in place to manage. And so as that scale increases, it becomes even more so incumbent upon us to ensure that we put the systems in place. And that's one of the recommendations I would want to make. In the petroleum sector, we are largely relying on what the oil companies provide to us. We are not independently checking. We are behind the curve, but I think we have to start to get there. Permits were issued with old data from, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. That does not tell us what the situation is now. Permits issued in breach of the law. I myself had to fight one in court, and I have another one in court at the moment, because from a civil society perspective, you realize that talking about it isn't working. So citizens have to resort to these measures to force our institutions that should be working on our behalf to just do what is right. And this is not pointing finger at one government or the other. This has been going on for some time. My two colleagues identified a current case and a previous case, which I think is enough to show that it's not only last week that something has been happening. And so from a civil society perspective, for me, I think that that's one of the fights that we have, one of the things that civil society is trying to push to change that and try to get our institutions to do what is right. Just with the Gas to Shore project, recently a judgment was handed down saying that it was in breach of the law. However, there were no penalties. I wonder about that, but it's that kind of thing that we have to clean all of that up, so that going forward, at least the laws we have on the books, we're following them. And now we can start to look at those things that increase the value, those things that focus on improving well-being of citizens, and so forth. So in closing, because the oil and gas sector promises to generate revenue on such large scales, and because we have the examples around the world, Venezuela right next door, of what can happen even when you have that, I think it's so much more important that we avoid repeating any of that. And so the breaches of laws don't feel promising to me. And it just makes you wonder about how things will go in the future, both the near future and the distant future, because I'm thinking about intergenerational justice as well, the responsibility we have for the next generations to come. Weak institutions is something that we're grappling with, and I think we have to find a way to strengthen the institutions, make them independent, so that they can't be influenced by strong personalities that come around every now and again, that we have enduring predictability about how our institutions will operate. And I want to stop there on that.
Dr. Thomas, you've justified why it was that I wanted you to speak in this context. I think you've laid it out. I think your last remark of just thinking institutions have to have some consistency and predictability over time. And this larger question that you've introduced into the conversation is a very important one, which is we have to keep in mind, as Ambassador Skull noted, this is a once in a 500-year opportunity, and we have to keep in mind that it took us much more than 500 years to get to this point, and we owe the people who will be Guyanese 500 years from now being rigorous and thoughtful in this moment. And I think you've framed that very effectively. It's amazing how the time runs out on these things. I have lots of questions on the board, so I'm just to take your question. I'm going to ask David to just kind of, David, sum us up a little, and then I'm just going to put one question up, which comes from Leonie Hazelwood. And so it goes to the question that you just raised about the people's broad involvement. And so as instruments of the people, so to speak, are the regional democratic councils, etc. And so we didn't have a chance. There were lots of questions about infrastructure investment and questions about their, procurement and how transparent and so on. But I think maybe this can capture, to what extent are the actual organs of the democracy involved in this. And maybe we'll come back at some point and speak to the question of data and availability of data for making these decisions. So David, you go first, and then we'll just let it go freewheeling for a couple of minutes. We'll give everyone a chance to get a wrap up.
Sure. Thank you very much, Terence, and thank you to all our speakers. I'm just going to revert to one of my original comments, which has to do with institutions matter, and as everyone has mentioned, institutional capabilities and capacities in Guyana to really manage not just the massive growth in the oil and energy sector, but throughout, particularly from the regulatory, transparency, accountability aspects in terms of the public service, and then also civil society. And I think everything having to do, which we've discussed in many of our webinars, the skills training needed at the private sector level, in the public sector, at civil society, to be able to manage not just the largesse, but the complexity and diversity of the economic activity taking place in Guyana, and how you match that with the regulatory legal framework and the jurisprudence on it. And I think we've been seeing in various areas how there's an asymmetry in terms of the capability to follow up on that. And to many degrees, what I've been calling, it's resulted in sort of the recrimination politics in Guyana, as opposed to constructive politics. Okay, how do we fix this? How do we prepare ourselves to be able to manage this largesse? So I think that's something that's still critical. I'm glad that Troy Thomas is with the university, because one of the things and programs we've had have to do with the role of the university and other tertiary institutions on training and developing the skills in the public and private sector to be able to manage this, so that the dialogue and the discussion is an informed one, and where we have those capabilities, because those asymmetries, as Ambassador Skoll mentioned early on, open the door for the possibility of corruption, lack of transparency, and lack of accountability. In the best of cases, just because we can't manage it, we don't know. In the worst of cases, because then it's a fertile ground for negative influence peddling in these situations, because the other side just, it's the easiest thing to do, because I can't manage it. So let me just go with the flow. So I think it's very important that at some point, a lot of this be focused on in terms of those skills, the training, and the human resource and institutional capacity and capability in Guyana to manage this largesse?
Yeah, thank you, David. Ambassador Skoll, I started off, you introduced me to a new thing, IPSIG. I don't think we need an IPSIG, but what are your final thoughts given what you've heard here today?
Well, I think Guyana is doing the right thing. It is competing for oil investment, and I am absolutely convinced in these circumstances that every hour, every dollar spent on counter money laundering and anti-corruption comes back manyfold to help the people of Guyana. Do not underestimate the attractiveness of a country, even a country like Guyana, which is overflowing with oil and gas. Do not underestimate the attractiveness, the competitive attractiveness of a country that does all that is necessary to clean itself up and to make transparency, anti-corruption, counter money laundering the law of the land. And one final obvious note: don't do it like Venezuela.
Thank you. So now we have Joel Nelson, and so let's take Ambassador Skoll's sort of thought. So Joel, the question is, how are you and Elson working together in order to achieve the sort of goal that Ambassador Skoll has set us? I mean, as you look forward to the future, I mean, and I actually want to put one other question in there to you as people who are broadly part of the, more forward-facing political establishment. Dr. Thomas talked about, the intergenerational equity, which is a subject that's sort of dear to my heart also, and I want you to, as you respond of how you work together, so I'll give Joel first and then you, Elson, and then we'll give the last word to Dr. Thomas. As you respond, think through how you address, how do we work together to minimize corruption, to increase transparency and accountability in the interests of Guyanese citizens, not just today, but, at 2 generations down.
Thank you, Dr. Blackman. First, let me take the opportunity to respond to a few things to Dr. Thomas. And in fairness to him, I'm not going to be too hard on him because he has acknowledged in his opening remark that he's not been in tune with current affairs. So let me take this opportunity to bring him up to date on some of the things that he has mentioned and he's concerned about, starting with let's start with Article 13. I agree with Dr. Thomas that our Constitution provides for more involvement of the wider population in terms of decision making and policy making, and to put that to get a practical understanding of how the administration of the day is seeking to achieve that objective is in several ways. One, for example, is that they have, and credit to them, they have consistently, since they have assumed office in 2020, they have been consistently engaged with the people across the country at the regional level. And this is verifiable because all of these engagements are streamed live publicly. And you can see in the community reaches, ministers of government, the highest level of the president, we've had for the, in a while, the president and government officers are highly accessible. And you can see that decisions are made on the spot at the ordinary level of the people in the community, whether be that infrastructure requests for roads, dealing with administrative issues, access to land, agriculture. We've seen that replicated across the country. That's the first. The second way they seek to do this is in a more formal way with the established bodies that are there, civil society organizations, private sector bodies, engaging, having various segments of consultative processes on various policies. And thirdly, you have important bills to be tabled, which with the view of being tabled in the National Assembly to become legislation. Those are, if you go now on the Attorney General's website, you would see there are bills open for public consultation from the wider population, not only organizations and NGOs. The fourth, and this one is pretty much refreshing too. And some people, some supporters of the government tend to criticize the government for this, as in the government is wasting its time. Where specifically you have the vice president tries to keep up with a weekly press conference, and he takes the opportunity to go through letters written in the media by ordinary writers, whether they're critiques of government or not, and he takes the time to not only respond to them, but if one pays attention, he also acknowledges proper, constructive criticism, and he, on some occasions, he's agreed with some of the editorials. And so those are four important ways in which the government, seeks to have more involvement of the wider population in terms of decision making. Now for the question of intergenerational wealth. So maybe my colleague, Dr. Thomas, may have missed, we had the first legislation which was enacted in a period, in a peculiar time when the parliament, and this is debatable, didn't have the authority to pass legislations, notwithstanding the previous government passed the NRF, the first version of the Natural Resource Fund Act. And in relation to the first version, Dr. Thomas' concerns are absolutely correct, because the formula, for example, the formula for withdrawals from the Natural Resource Fund, was a sophisticated formula, a sophisticated mathematical formula determined only by the minister. So even me, I'm a financial analyst. I wasn't able to figure out the formula. And sophistication, those who are transparency experts, complexity is the enemy to transparency. Simplicity is the friend of transparency. So in the amended version by the incumbent regime, you have a very simple formula that even a primary school kid could look at the formula, and all in terms of transparency, that is public knowledge. The deposits to the funds, the reports, all this is public knowledge. Speaking of transparency, and anybody could calculate at the end of the year how much money we could withdraw from the Natural Resource Fund to finance the budget. Now, when you look at the formula, it is designed in a way to cater for intergenerational wealth. It's a sliding scale. So it starts from 100%, 75%, come down to 25%, 5%, 3%. As the fund balance grows in the fund, the withdrawals from the fund over the years, as we build up, it will start to decline in terms of the transfer to the budget. It is designed in that way. Now, because of our development needs, which is so great in all areas, infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so many other areas, we need to spend upfront because it's not a lot of money now, but in the outer years, as we ramp up production, the fund balance will grow, the capital budget will eventually come down as we invest in all of that. So the current Natural Resource Fund Act and the formula is designed to cater for intergenerational wealth. So that's the two main things you asked me to that I want.
The third one is, I want the third one where you and Elson are working together.
So the third one, the third one, I think, and again, to understand where the strides we have made, and again, I'm not speaking from a political perspective. I'm speaking from a pure objective perspective as possible. When you look at from where we came from politically, historically, how the two sides are now working together, Yes, there will be differences. That is politics. But I think there are enough evidence to say that the two sides have improved drastically compared to the history that we came from. And there are examples that we could point to. For example, the local content legislation. There are several pieces of legislation that both sides, the opposition brought their submission, it was taken on board. If you pay attention to other matters in the National Assembly, the business of the House, opposition supports certain things, government agree with certain things. So we've come a long way in terms of the two sides working together formally as well as informally. Another important example that I want to reference is we spoke about Venezuela as an example. The ambassador who was appointed to Venezuela is a top executive on the opposition side that was appointed by the government to the Central Venezuela. Again, and the other key advisor to the government, on the Venezuelan border is also an executive of the opposition. So those are examples that are positive signs showing where the two sides have improved in terms of a working relationship. And for me, as far as I'm concerned, I am very optimistic that that relationship, that kind of cooperation, and so on, will only improve as we go forward.
Thank you, Joel. So, Elson, you get the response, and then finally we'll go to Troy for the last word. You're muted. You're muted, Elson. You're muted.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Quite a few issues that have been covered. Mr. Thomas, I see you got quite a few responses to you there. I just want to start out by I think what you may have been hinting to is that regarding the NRF. So I'll start with the last thing that was mentioned first. There was a 22-member board of the NRF, which included members from across Guyana civil society, various organizations, the University of Guyana. And that board was really supposed to give insight as to the use of those funds and the governance of the NRF. Obviously, the reason that has sparked a lot of controversy is that board was dismantled. The 22 members was collapsed, and as a result, a lot of people perhaps feel frustrated. I myself have said that doing that was an abomination, and I called the University of Guyana representatives to tell them that they were being removed from the NRF board, which I thought was particularly problematic because, of course, University of Guyana, being a research institution, could provide insight. And so, while we may hear what I would term remarks or potentially positive sounding remarks, sometimes the facts don't align. I would also point out that earlier it was mentioned that regarding the audit, just to give you a sense of facts, that the cost oil audit is not an audit where you're taking a sample. I have here remarks from the current auditor, Mr. Haynes, where he says that he is taking a sample for the cost oil audit. So I just want to point out that sometimes you hear factually incorrect things that are put out there. And unfortunately, that's been one of the barriers to being able to work closely with Mr. Bagmondin, is that there's a frequency of factual errors and mathematical errors. Now, his arguments and ideas, I always want to engage with anyone's arguments and ideas. But too much time has to be spent on those types of things. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that, in the course of the discussion, I think there's something that was missing, and it's the idea of justice, of good governance for its own sake. It feels to me like maybe something was in the atmosphere that just because lots of foreign investors are coming, it's okay if your systems are corrupt or are not as dealing with corruption in the way that they should be dealing with it. And I want to point out that it is not just that we're dealing with corruption for economic reasons, but because it is an injustice. It means that people are excluded. It means that people do not receive what they should receive, the benefits they should receive. And that, I think, goes back to what Mr. Thomas is saying about this, making sure that this growth in these numbers mean tangible improvements in people's lives. That's the first point. The second point is, of course, it was mentioned that laws are continuing to be dealt with, despite the fact that these 2 officials have been appointed. I have here again remarks from the CCJ president where he says, this is in 2022, we should not let the year pass without these people being appointed. Now, from the perspective of justice, we in Guyana, Guyanese citizens, have a right to have people in positions that are in the way that they're intended to be. It should not be a makeshift process every single year, but rather that people are able to act without fear of victimization, without fear of influence, uh, and we should see our judicial system fall under the same heading. And so that is one of the reasons why it is important to have these people, even if it is not these justices, it's important to have justices appointed on a permanent basis so that they can administer justice. I was recently, some of you may know, I was in the US recently, and I stopped by this courthouse that I always stop by, and it says the truest pillar of good governance is the true administration of justice. That's what it says on the in the Manhattan courthouse. Now, the reason to have these people appointed is because it is in the interest of justice. And I believe that citizens want to live in a just society, not just a society where capital is flowing in, but a just society. And so we must not, I think, neglect that or minimize it or not mention it, that these things are good for their own sake. I think also some of what was mentioned regarding, of course, the question of local government, whether local government institutions are involved. It was mentioned that the government goes and meets directly with people and decisions are made on the spot. But I think that it seems to me that that assumes that a decision made on the spot, raised, whether it's in regard to an issue raised by residents, is a good thing. And that is not necessarily clear because it's a question of who was there, who made representation, whether they had the facts in place. Now, the reason that we have institutions and structures in place is so that we can produce good decisions. It's not just a man shows up one day and says, oh, we're going to build a road here, and there's no studies been done. Now I circle back to the first point that I made, which is around feasibility studies. And so I'm getting at is there's a difference between governing well and governing. You can govern, go through the motions, but are you doing a good job when it comes to your governance? Are you investing in strong institutions? Are you enabling institutions? Are you, as was mentioned by Ms. Lewis, building capacity? Another person mentioned the audit capacity of the country and GRA. We've repeatedly said in the opposition, GRA must be supported in terms of staffing and in terms of budget to ensure that they can have that capacity. It shouldn't be that they have to say that they find difficulties with getting auditors. So from those perspectives, I think that we must understand that good governance is not just a revenue stream metric. It is a metric in terms of people's tangible improvement in people's lives, which is why, of course, Lady Opposition has a people-centered vision. But also, it is important for its own sake because I believe that Guyanese want to live in a just society.
Well, I take your point, and
Professor,
wait,
Professor, can I just respond to
I'll
two
give
things?
I'll give you 30 seconds, just a quick response. But I was about, as I was listening to you, I sort of had the sense that, so I wanted to say two things. One, when David and I kind of planned the program on accountability, like you said, we wrote up this program for accountability on this date without any thought to any of the local concerns. So our accountability program was scheduled, last year. And so I want you to understand that we were not just making this up today. We're making this up as a way of thinking of a broad scope of the set of issues that we thought would be important for Guyana. And as we are seeing here, this question of transparency and accountability is one that certainly has some flame attached to it, has some deep resonance, as you can see from some of the questions, and so on. So it's something that we want to come back, because one of the things I've noted in some private communication, I've gotten private communication that you haven't said anything about the EITI and the detail about the EITI. So it seems to me, David, that we're going to have a program that is just about the EITI. This will be sort of like, or this is kind of like the opening salvo to kind of raise the issue of accountability and transparency and its importance. And I want to apologize to you in this way, Elson, because, coming from the perspective of the Guyana Business Journal, we wanted to frame this in the context of, in a sense, that the cost of borrowing money, not not solely, but to understand that in order for this development and the well-being to take place, you need businesses to drive that. And if you need businesses to drive that, businesses have to have the kinds of conditions that are necessary in order to invest their money. And so my I hope I didn't leave the impression that this was our only concern, but it is a concern, and and it is a driving concern. So now we're pushing way past the time for what we usually do. So Joe, I'll give you 30 seconds to respond, and then I'll ask Troy to give a final
Thank
remark.
you.
David will say,
It's unfortunate that my colleague couldn't see that the two sides could work positively and that relationship could improve, as we go forward into the future. And it is unfortunate that he could not, take off his political cap just for a bit and present objective analysis. Because I just want to demonstrate one example. I don't want to take everything he said in the interest of time. Let's come back to the governance structure of the Natural Resource Fund. You referenced this particular committee, 22 members reduced to, I think, half the number. But what he failed to say is that in the previous, in that structure, you had the minister that appointed everybody, all the committees, including the accountability, everybody. And he was at the top. In the current governance structure, that has changed substantially from a good governance standpoint, where even though you had that committee reduced, let's understand how it was reduced. You have all these different related organizations. Take, for example, the private sector. The private sector have about over 10, 12 different organized business support organizations. You got the GCCI, GOGEC, TAG, GMSA, Private Sector Commission. The Private Sector Commission is the umbrella body for all of them. So rather than having one rep from all the organizations, we said the private sector, you all nominate one person to represent the private sector. The same thing for the professional services associations. You have the accounting profession, the accounting fraternity, legal fraternity. Rather than having different people from all these associations, you all come together as professional services body and nominate somebody. Then you have a nomination from the National Assembly. You have the ministerial oversight was removed completely and was replaced with a board of directors. So you have a board of directors. Then you have the central bank, that is the operational authority that manages the fund in terms of the operations of the fund. You have the whole governance structure of the central bank. You have the whole Ministry of Finance. You have the board of governors of the Natural Resource Fund. And then you have the ultimate oversight body, which is the National Assembly. So I just wanted to elaborate on that point.
and I want to say this is also an area I think we have scheduled down the line a program that just addresses specifically the National Resource Fund. I think that's one of the things in our program outline for the rest of the year. Dr. Thomas, I want to give you the last remark, and then we'll ask David to say thank you.
All right, thank you, and I'll try to be very quick. Just in case it got lost in translation, I just want to underscore that the points I made were not uh, an identification of the absence of anything, but more so of what I think is important and of the need to continue to improve in all of those areas, because the moment we believe we have achieved it, we can sit back and let things slip. So that's the perspective I want to take on that. I also want to underscore intergenerational justice, which I think is it's fairly broad. And Professor, you mentioned intergenerational equity or some variant of it like that. It does involve the financial component, but other things as well. And one of the things in the back of my mind as I say that is also the the environment that we leave for the next generation to to live in. I think it's perhaps even more important. And so I know we're talking about transparency, accountability, petroleum sector, but I didn't want that part to get lost. And I didn't necessarily mention all the things that I had planned to say, because indeed I planned to mention EITI and so forth, but I kind of, as I was looking at the time, I just left some things out. One more thing I want to mention, this is a new point, is I think it's important that we're able to track petroleum revenues through the budget. Not only to know that it's going into the budget, and I failed to mention this earlier because I think it's an important point that ties into inclusivity. If we want to, because of the justice issue involved in natural resources, we want to make sure that it's going to the right places, that it's meeting Guyanese across the spectrum, that the impact is on a diverse set of Guyanese, not concentrated in certain areas versus others. And so I think it means that we need to be able to track it through the budget to see where it's going. And it comes back to my point about data, the kind of data that we gather and so we can see that and we feel good that, okay, this thing is doing what we think it should be doing. Again, not an accusation. It's a thing about what I think. I'm thinking about where we should go or what we should aim to achieve with it. So as we're talking about inclusivity and so forth, I know inclusivity has the component of contributing to decisions, but it also has the component of what impacts the revenues have on the spectrum of people that we have as Guyanese, and are we doing justice by them in that way? Beyond that, I just want to say I enjoyed the discussion and some of the back and forth. I smile a little bit. I hope that while we debate our points, and that's important because if you believe something, you should represent it, but also give the other perspective a little chance to simmer a bit because we can sometimes glean something from it. And I want to end it there. Thank you for the opportunity to engage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. And David, you get to say thank you on our behalf. And we already identified two more.
Well, Terence,
Go ahead, David.
thank you all for joining us, giving time and thank you all for joining us and giving time and thought to this, collaborating with us. And clearly, I think both the EITI and NRF are topics that we need to delve deeper into, and particularly from also get a better sense, again, harping back the institutional capabilities and capacities, where we're at with the Transparency Institute in Guyana, and it's linked to Transparency International and so on. Because I think, as Ambassador Skoll pointed out, there's an entire global infrastructure that can support Guyana in many of these initiatives, and it behooves the country at the government, private sector, civil society level to take advantage of this. We're not starting from scratch, and Guyana is not alone. So I think it's very important to take advantage of that. We hope you all join us next month. Wednesday, November 8th will be our episode 6 of the webinars, and that time we'll be focusing actually on workforce development and skills training across the economy, which is something that was mentioned today and is critical not just in some of the real business economy sectors in Guyana, construction, infrastructure, and so on, but also in the whole policy framework and regulatory framework in the public sector and the private sector. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to next month and to keeping in touch. Appreciate your time and support.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much. This was, so actually, we went over time, but I couldn't